Great. Thank you, Anthony. Hello and welcome, everyone. Good evening, or whatever time it is where you are. It's not evening for Sally. Hi, Sally. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's kind of partly cloudy and a lovely summer day here.
Yeah, the Northeast has not been so warm today, but at least it is supposed to be one of the longest days of the year. So I hope that some of it will be reflected in the weather tomorrow. I'm very happy to be talking to you, and I want to start. Well, Anthony's done the sort of the round of introductions, but I thought I could start with a slightly embarrassing way of introducing, the story of how I became acquainted with your work, or what I used to do once I became acquainted with your work. Or rather, the story is not so embarrassing, but the analogy I'm going to be using is a bit embarrassing. Some of you may know the story according to which UK's former and famous Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher went around and basically would take out Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, slam the book on the table and say, this is what we believe. Well, when I first started doing social ontology, as a budding ontologist, as it were, and in particular with the Cambridge Social Ontology group, I used to flip out Sally's Resisting Reality and say, this is what I mean by doing social ontology. No joke. Now, however, in opposition to what Margaret Thatcher or Thatcher's interpretation of Friedrich Hayek used to say, which is that there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and families, by which apparently UK's, at that point, conservative government wanted to convey the fact that there is nothing in particular or specific, there is no sui generis nature of the social. Sally's work has been arguing something that is very much different, which is not only that there is such a thing as the social, but also, and more importantly, that the social is something that philosophers and possibly also some theorists have not paid sufficient attention to. And Sally's latest, or as Anthony said, upcoming book, Doing Justice to the Social, makes exactly this argument. Like Resisting Reality, it is also a collection of papers, some of which have been published before. But what brings them together, as I'm pretty sure Sally will tell us, is precisely this idea that there is something about the social that perhaps has not been done justice to. So my first question to you, Sally, is, in what sense do you think philosophers have not really done justice to the social previously? What is it that prevented them from engaging with the social in the way in which you have and you think one should?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm honored and humbled. It really means so much to me that you've taken up my work in a way that you ally yourself with some of the effort, because it's a big effort and I'm only scratching the surface. So the book is going to have three parts. One is going to be a kind of social ontology of social practices and social structures. And the middle section is going to be about explanation, mainly, sort of why should we resist methodological individualism as an explanatory mode. And then the third section is going to be on normative questions that I think fall through the cracks. So when I think about philosophers not paying due justice, not doing justice to the social, I think there's part of it is the social ontology. So in the context of the social ontology of Margaret Gilbert and Michael Bratman and others, they take as their paradigm painting a barn together or a house together, going on a walk together. And the model is joint intentionality. And I'm not denying that that's an important phenomenon and a phenomenon to care about. But I'm interested in social groups and social kinds and social categories where we don't necessarily know each other, so genders and races, and I think of them as positions within social structures. And so the idea of a social structure, I think, has not been given due attention in philosophy. And that's in part because, and this is where the second part of it comes in, the kind of methodological individualism that isn't just in philosophy, but it used to be across the social sciences. But philosophy, of course, is behind what gets done in the other social sciences, except for if you count psychology. And social structures are the skeleton of a system, of a social system. And social systems are not reducible to behavior of the little bits and parts. And this has been known in biology for a long time. I mean, there's whole departments of systems research, right, that are resistant to a kind of reductionism. And so I think that sometimes philosophers are resistant to that because of their interest in the fundamental. So a lot of philosophers have been committed to a kind of naturalism that involves reduction to, you know, microparticles or whatever, and everything else supervening on that. There's a kind of reductionism there, but also it's a kind of fundamentalism that ontology is structured in this levels, in a kind of set of levels. But we know from systems research and many other disciplines that that's really not how reality is structured. It's not structured by these levels. And so I'm interested in the second part in looking at, well, I'm moving now increasingly into complex dynamic systems theory, because there's a place where explanation in terms of systems has really developed quite significantly. And I'm just a novice, but I think it really suits the social domain. And so there's that part. And then there's the other part about normativity. So in the context of philosophy, I think that there are two kinds of questions that people tend to ask. What should I do? That's ethics, you know, what should I do? The moral philosophy of the individual. Maybe sometimes you can get a second person in there, like the Darwinian second person. And so you might end up with a kind of the sociality of a sort of Bratman-Gilbert style sociality. But it tends to be about individuals, or we're talking about the state. And what should the state do? And the state is conceived of as like this great, you know, think of Hobbes' Leviathan frontispiece, you know, okay, there's the Leviathan, we're going to figure out what the state should do. But I think a lot of our lives are lived in this middle space where we're trying to organize ourselves as a family or as a neighborhood or as a union or, you know, something that is of a smaller size, even a department or a classroom. And we're trying to figure out how ought we organize ourselves in smaller groups. But also there are going to be sometimes groups where we don't know each other. So it's going to, how should we organize a transportation system in Boston? How should we organize the school system in Boston? These are sorts of things. This is this mid-level or meso-level set of questions that I think are not well answered if you're only going for a Rawlsian sort of basic structure and the principles, or what should I do as an individual? We're trying to create systems of coordination and systems that enable us to collaborate, cooperate, coordinate. And so I'm interested in that domain. And I think a lot of philosophers, my own view is a lot of philosophers doing political philosophy have resisted that because they're liberals, right? And they think, oh, we can talk about the state and the limits of the state and the individual, but you know, that middle ground, okay, that's not for us because everybody's got their own culture and you just have to respect the culture. And so and I'm going, what? You know, anyway, first of all, I don't think that you have, I mean, culture is a complicated thing and that philosophers can intervene into cultures and make contributions and shift the focus of culture. I think that's appropriate for us. And I also think that, that there are normative questions that need to be asked about on the ground systems of social organization.
Can I interrupt you there? Because
please.
You've basically covered you've covered a lot of ground, and it seems to me some of the things you have been talking about, including obviously meso-level theories, but also questions of, you know, what makes the social, what makes a community, how do we arrange or engage in discussions about arranging social relations that are not necessarily or only on the level of the state, but are also not necessarily dyadic, so to individuals. A lot of that has been addressed historically, although not always in ways that are not methodologically individualist, and I admit as much by disciplines such as, for instance, sociology and anthropology. Why do you think philosophy has been so reluctant to take up some of those insights? Because I find myself, as someone who has degrees in both sociology and anthropology, but has also been trained in philosophy, I often find myself reading contemporary philosophy and thinking, oh, well, yes, there we go. Philosophers discover basic insights in anthropology, again, surprise, surprise. And I'm often reminded of something that shaped what I decided, or how I decided to focus, I guess, what would be the equivalent of my major. So when I was kind of choosing what subject to focus on in my undergrad, I read a sentence from an anthropologist, actually, called Thomas Hyland Eriksson, who wrote something saying, anthropology is philosophy with the people in. And I said, great, I'm going to do that. I don't want to do formal philosophy. I don't want to do, metaphysics without the people. I don't want to do normative kind of theory without consideration of the people. So from that perspective, why do you think that philosophy is so reluctant to engage with these disciplines that are sometimes, I think, unnecessarily seen as more empirical? Is it disciplinary imperialism, or is it perhaps this, what you mentioned at the beginning, which is the assumption that if we go down to fundamentals, we have to go down to first principles, and obviously first principles are acultural, ahistorical, everything, universal, and thus not in any sort of way, not only not specific, but basically any kind of empirical input is irrelevant and has to be rendered irrelevant.
Yeah, great question. So I think it's a hard question because it's about, the history of philosophy in the 20th century, among other times. And I'm sure there are many different forces at work. I think you're right that philosophy has carved out for itself this domain of the a priori, so that we could have a domain of a subject matter, and otherwise it slips away from us, right? If we start doing empirical work, then suddenly it's not philosophy anymore, because it then becomes psychology or sociology or something like this. And so I think there is this desire to carve out this space of the a priori, or sometimes it's the normative, that you carve out the space of the normative. That's what we're doing. But the normative too, it's not just what people think. That's what the social scientists do. It's what they ought to think. And that's a distinctive domain for the philosopher. And so this line has been policed quite stringently. But it's also the case that more and more philosophy has been naturalized since Quine, and there is this move to naturalizing. But the naturalizing move, as I see it, has often taken people down this reductionist route. And you say, oh, if you really want to understand things, you're going to have to go to the lower level and go to the lower level and go to the lower level. So in the ontology domain, I think that the kind of physicalism, a certain kind of naturalism has skipped over the social sciences to go to the natural sciences. And another, I think, is that the humanities are, well, I'm at MIT, and at MIT, the humanities don't get a lot of respect because it's mostly devoted to science and engineering. And so I have a very vivid sense of maybe a throwback to a time when to have credibility in the academy was to have a methodology that was similar to what they offered in the natural sciences and logic and mathematics. And so that seemed more secure for philosophy to sort of latch on to a methodology that would glorify those aspects of knowledge production. as opposed to what happens in the social sciences. And so I still think that there's tremendous bias in philosophy against, cultural studies, literary studies, history, other social sciences, because they're not rigorous, right? They're not sufficiently rigorous. Where people say this who've never read any, as far as I can tell, anything. So I was the director of women's and gender studies for a number of years, and I've always been jointly appointed in a women's and gender studies program. So I spend a lot of time in these interdisciplinary contexts, and I find some of the other disciplines are so acutely methodologically sensitive, and the way the historians deal with evidence, historical evidence, is just mind-bogglingly interesting. And but a lot of philosophers just have never had that experience, and so they don't understand that there's a kind of rigor that is distinctive of these other fields that they don't understand, and so they dismiss them as not sufficiently rigorous. And I think that's a failure of the discipline.
I think that brings us very nicely to the sort of the second point I was going to address, which is, and I think you picked up on it already, which is what happens with the normative, or to the normative, if we acknowledge that some criteria or some kinds of inquiry are necessarily not universal, or that perhaps they're not naturally universal. And that's whether that leaves us without the option to talk about normativity, at least in the universal mode. And that brings me to sort of approaching, or the other direction from which we can approach the title of your book, which is, how do we go about doing social to justice? So what happens if we socialize, which also means then provincialize or relativize the notion of justice? Does it leave us without the necessary position from which to talk about normativity? What does it mean if we start talking about going beyond justice, as for instance, say, philosopher Lewis Gordon, whom we've also had as one of the speakers in the Philosophers series, suggests? And also, what does this mean for how we think about the relationship between our own sort of normative commitments as well as our academic commitments, which is something that I'll come back to later. And I think it goes down to the question of, well, okay, is the social actually prior to the normative, or do we need to have a sense of the normative that's, again, transhistorical, translocal, or in this particular, or in, well, at least in what seems to be the dominant case, sort of ahistorical and alocal, meaning not spatialized in any sort of way?
Yeah, a lot of really good questions. I'm, again, barely going to scrape the surface. So I think that value, so first of all, let me say, I'm not opposed to people doing ideal theory. I think we need all different kinds of theorizing. I'm a pluralist about method. I'm a pluralist about, what we all should be doing and how we can collaborate together to do better philosophy. So I'm not someone who's saying ideal theory is pointless, it has all these false presuppositions. I think there are problems if you try to do ideal theory in the context of the social domain. And that's in part because as I understand our concept of justice or of injustice or of different values, they're indeterminate, right? They're highly indeterminate. And they're going to have to gain determinacy in a particular socio-historical cultural moment. And how they do will depend on the cultural resources and concepts that are available, on the material conditions that people are in, the particular needs of people in that context. And so they take shape. So in this abstract and inchoate and sort of indeterminate form, they're not action guiding. They're just, treat likes alike and unlikes unlike. And you go, great, thanks a lot. That's nothing. I got nothing there. And I'm not saying, anyway. And so you've got to in order to apply them, you've got to sort of situate them within a particular historical cultural moment. I really like Jack Balkin's work. Jack Balkin is a legal theorist. He has a book called Cultural Software that I rely on a lot. And he describes this as a kind of path dependence of value. And so he says, for example, there is such a thing as aesthetic value. So but beauty and the experience of beauty and the experience of whatever else, art might be seeking besides beauty, certain kinds of imagination or stimulation, that this has evolved. Our capacity to have those experiences and the shape of those experiences evolves over time. And his example is, you can't even have an aesthetic sensibility that appreciates rock and roll until electric guitars are invented, right? So the sensibilities that we gain in interaction and that we develop in interaction are going to be conditioned very much by the material conditions of our world, by the history that our culture has been through. So I think that right now in the United States, our culture is trying to cope with this long history of systemic racism. And so our solution to issues of racism are going to have to look very different from what it might look like in another context because of that history and because of the sensibilities that people have developed being brought up in our particular American context. And so what I'm inclined to say is, yes, there's going to be constraints. We still have a sense of justice or fairness or any number of other kinds of evaluative concepts. And we'll be able to say, whoa, that goes way beyond what is acceptable. But it's not yet determinate until we try to sort of work it out materially in the lives of people. Does that help?
I think that's a great point. And I think it does, some of the issues you are raising or some of the things you have mentioned to me speak also to some of the sort of more recent and more interesting developments in social theorizing, including sort of the concepts of the psychosocial or biosocial, as well as some of the older work in, say, actor network theory and some of the newer work in new materialisms. So I obviously think that's great. The other thing that it does bring to mind, though, is precisely this question of sort of locality or the relationship between non-localism and non-ideal theory. And you've mentioned the question of race and racism. And, as someone who is based in the UK, I've been particularly interested in observing how some of these issues are, I would say, translated between the US and the UK contexts. What gets passed on, what gets filtered through, etc. From different perspectives, including, what we're seeing recently in the UK, as well as in France, speaking, for instance, of continental Europe, is this critique of critical race theory from conservative or even, governments that could be, under some context, described as liberal in the continental sense, admittedly not liberal in the American sense, as something that's kind of imported or corrupting actually the social structure or the social order, and so on and so forth. So speaking of that, I'm wondering, because we are always in some ways talking about also communication and translation of theoretical or philosophical concepts. How can we work towards building, so what is, in a manner of speaking, the kind of the Goldilocks ratio of specificity and universality when it comes to concepts? So what makes them still useful in different contexts whilst not leaving them the opportunity to exercise some sort of imperial constraining force on local interpretations. We discussed this earlier when we had a chat, but for instance, I found Serene Cado's work in Decolonizing Universalism for Transnational Feminist Ethics really appealing in that sense, because it is an argument about how we can have a degree of discussion about, or well, a degree of universalism, whilst not reproducing some of the sort of imperial, colonial, etc. logics of normativity. So where would you kind of position your project on that continuum between sort of hyper-local, so to speak, or particularist, and then universal?
Yeah, great question. So I love Cater's work, and I think her idea too of this this sense of the indeterminacy, but still seriousness of certain ideas of proportionality, equality, sort of fairness, these sorts of things, that those are not, they may be indeterminate, but they're not pointless, right? They're not content free. They do set some constraints. And so we can begin to sort of see how they are taken up culturally in different ways. And one of the problems of the colonizing universalism is it takes our particular mode of sort of realizing or manifesting that more indeterminate concept and imposes it on another without actually understanding the social, cultural, historical context. And so I don't have a golden ratio that I can suggest, but I have more of a method that that is similar to Cater's, I think, in trying to work it out in time, in place. So I work with a group in Kenya, for example, on empowering women and girls. And we work very collaboratively, where I'm learning about their culture, and I'm trying to see what would count as empowerment for the women in that culture, rather than deciding from my perspective, what would count as empowerment. And it's tricky because, of course, that kind of open communication without a lot of background, the social and cultural background, can be hard because they are feeling they see America as offering answers and technology and resources and things like that. And so they will sometimes more easily sort of cave to me than I want them to. But it's a process of conversation in trying to learn from them about what justice would be for women or what empowerment would be for women in that context. And sometimes just to take the baby steps, right? And to work with them on that and to find common ground in spite of the local difference. And so I don't think that theorists who work a priori are in a great position to say, okay, this is where the universal is and this is where the particular is. So you take your universal part over to this place and then sort of implement it. It's no. You try to learn what part of your thinking is more universal and what part of it is more local by interacting with people who are in different contexts and who are facing different material and social challenges. So I'm not sure that that's an answer, but it's refusing to say that there is a neat ratio, because that's being discovered and refigured in history, in time, in place. Does that make sense?
I think it's also a great reminder of how impossible, as it were, it is to sort of step outside of our own position in relation to precisely, within social structures, and that includes different kinds of positionality and different kinds of relationship to different kinds of power. And I mean, what you hint at is incredibly complex because it always involves different modes of relating to different social context and different structures. And one of the reasons why, for instance, I've been so interested in this paradoxical relationship between, well, knowledge and social critique, or knowledge and action, in other words, is precisely because I think that there is no way out of that catch-22, as it were. We need to be opening the floor for questions because they've already started pouring in. I'm sure there are going to be many more, but if I could use the last sort of 3.5 minutes to just ask you to sort of briefly say something about precisely this last point, which is how do you see the role of theorists and philosophers in relation to, well, the world that we're trying to comprehend, because it's quite clear that we can't just sort of happily take on the reformist mantle, or, I mean, maybe it's not clear to many other people, including many of our colleagues, but hopefully it is clear to, I would like to say that it's clear, as we sometimes tend to say, it is obvious to me that this must be the case, but we are always in that sense limited in many ways. So what would you say is the way to approach critique? What can critique do? What can't critique do? And at the end of the day, how can we ensure that the justice we do to the social is something other than just epistemic justice?
Yeah, that's a really hard and important question. So I'm inspired by a quote that Nancy Fraser takes, uses from Marx to say that the critical theorist is embedded in a social movement and is not trying to do philosophy or anything else in a kind of value-free mode. And I think that again, this is my choice about how I do philosophy. So there's a difference between doing feminist philosophy or anti-racist philosophy, where what you're doing is taking traditional philosophical questions and trying to think about them differently when you add gender or add race or add disability or such. Where how I think of my work is I'm in a social movement. I'm in a movement that is committed to feminism and anti-racism and is trying to achieve social justice. And then my philosophical questions are, what does the movement need in order to make progress, right? What are the challenges that are facing us? Of course, there are political challenges, there are material challenges, there are tons of economic challenges, but there's also conceptual challenges, right? How do we conceive of women? How do we conceive of race? How do we conceive of health? How do we conceive of these issues from the point of view of people who are fighting for social justice? We don't just take on the concepts that have been provided to us because they're so ideologically tainted that we have to rethink them and question them and sometimes reabsorb them. They're not all horrible, but what we have to do is to aim for a paradigm shift in so many different domains where we're creating new tools for thinking about our social embeddedness or our relationship to capitalism or these sorts of things. And so I don't see myself as separate from the movement. I see myself as deeply embedded in the movement. And yes, it's a division of labor. Some people are good at organizing marches. Other people are good at coming up with bumper stickers. I think bumper stickers are really important. I mean, I'm not saying it just to ridicule it or something. And other people are good at arguing something in a court or in a legislature. I happen to be good at thinking about what is the framework that we need for trying to understand what's going on here. What is a different framework that we could use that will enable us to see through some of the barriers to justice or fairness or non-domination? How do we reconsider our world and go through a paradigm shift so that we can understand better what we're trying to achieve? And so, yeah, it's going to be hard to say, oh yeah, and this changes the world. but we together change the world. No individual changes the world. Well, it's a complicated question. I could talk about that forever too. But we together change the world, and it's okay to have a division of labor in the movement.
I think that's a great point to end on. I think sort of it's an important reminder that sometimes, or at least I've always claimed this, that the best work we can do is actually not the work of theorizing, but it is literally what, sort of Judith Butler has also referred to as sort of bodies on the line. And I've been very adamant about this when it came to a lot of, union-related movements here in the UK, that sometimes actually the only thing that we need, the most important thing, is to show up. And I mean, and that's the bumper stickers paradigm.
I have a clear backpack, a transparent backpack that has, a water bottle and, a tambourine and all of my, various sorts of things ready to pick up as I head out the door. It's there ready to go.
Yeah, I think and I think that's really sort of an important note of epistemic humility, because I think sometimes even when we don't intend to, we're often we assume this preaching position, and sometimes it's really just about sort of showing up and shutting up and letting others speak. On that note, I think it's time I wish we could talk for much longer, but I am going to sort of start moving to questions, because we have, heaps coming in already. So I'll start from Mark Carrigan, who is asking, to what extent is the empirical complexity of the meso-social responsible for its neglect by philosophers?
Yeah, I think that's relevant, that it is very empirically complex. And I know, just as myself trying to learn some systems theory, that it's not easy. But philosophers are willing to do philosophy of quantum mechanics. That's empirically complex, but philosophers are ready to do it, right? So it seems like it's not enough to explain why philosophers. I think it's more the individualism and the thought that it all has to go through our heads somehow. That the social is somehow mind dependent in a way that if it's social, then we intended it, or that we jointly intended it, or it's about what's in our heads. And I'm very much not about that. My view is that, okay, our heads are playing a role, but a small role. And there's a lot of other forces at work. And yeah, it's complicated to think about those forces, but when you're looking at a small, like what to make for dinner, right? That's a complex question. And it's going to be, well, what cooking tools do I have? What material do I have? What do I want? What do my partners want? Where are we going to eat? What is all of that? Those are complex questions, and the social can be that size. It can be that size, like what to have for dinner, how to organize your family, who's going to shovel the sidewalks when it snows, right? These are meso level questions. I mean, they're kind of on the small side of meso, and there are people who are designing transportation systems, right? They're trying to deal with the complexity. Why can't, it just seems like weird that philosophers think, oh, it's too complex for me. It can't possibly be that.
I agree. I think it's also something that does happen a lot, and perhaps explains it's perhaps also part of the answer to Mark's question, which is often philosophers actually use the label social in order to dismiss some questions, which in a manner of speaking runs counter to the ambition to be the sort of or foundational discipline for thinking about objects in general. But then again, I think it also says something about disciplinary parochialism and disciplinary imperialism. We have a very interesting question coming up from Blas Radi, or Radi, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, who says, those of us who work on non-ideal theory often come up against an objection that says basically the same conclusions could have been reached from ideal theory, as if it were the same to start from injustice, which could be done following Sklar, for example, than from Habermas. What would you say to this objection to the relevance of non-ideal theory?
Well, I mean, maybe there are two possible responses. One is, I think that the domain of ideal theory has been very different from the domain of social theory or non-ideal theory. So the domain of the social, which is, I mean, so partly what I'm doing is taking that ideal, non-ideal and switching it to a social versus political. And I know that's a bit of a shift, but no one thinks that we can have an ideal theory of dating, right? You know, dating is how should young people meet their future partners and explore their budding sexuality, right? And it seems to me that this is a question that is very much in the social domain. It's at the meso level. And rape culture is the wrong way to do it, right? We know things are bad the way it's currently done. And we know that, you know, now that it's less heteronormative, it's getting better, et cetera, et cetera. But it's hard to imagine how you could do an ideal theory of dating, right? Because again, dating exists within this web of social practices that have to do with the organization of family life and the care of children and the economic system that is going to, you know, just sort of see the family as the economic unit and all of these sorts of things. And so there's a way in which I'm thinking, what are you talking? What would ideal theory be in this context? Maybe you could come up with a couple principles like no rape. Okay, good, got that. You know, that wasn't so hard. But the social theorist, the non-ideal theorist, is going to start with this question about a domain that has been neglected by philosophers, by mainstream philosophers. It's very much part of what feminist philosophers work on. And it's going to do it in a kind of historically and culturally sensitive way, seeing it as embedded. So, and I don't think that ideal theory could possibly give us answers to those sorts of questions. Another issue, I think, is when a lot of philosophers, because they come from relatively privileged backgrounds, usually, think of them mostly as white men, their experience of injustice is impoverished. They don't really know how. I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates has some wonderful quote about, you know, in all of your regressions and theories and principles and whatever, you have to remember that injustice happens to the body. It is something that, you know, teeth are broken out of your head. There's this, the hunger that you feel is gnawing at you and preventing you from thinking straight, right? So there's a kind of embodiedness to the experience of injustice and other you know, moral harms that I think gets sort of filtered out when we're starting to think about it at this very high level ideal theory. And so when you begin in that embodied experience, what looks like a solution is going to be kind of different from what you're getting at when you're looking at the ideal theory. That's sort of the phenomenology of injustice is extremely important, I think.
I think that also speaks very interestingly to the last question that we've received so far, which is Miriam Faisner's, how would you conceive of intersectional social positions and social structures? Because I think this speaks precisely to the ways in which different kinds of positions within social structures and thus obviously their intersections speak to theories of justice. I doubt that we'll have time to go through all of the questions, so I am going to move on. So very quickly, so Sophie H is asking, how do you think the social can be included more in philosophy? Would interdisciplinarity between sociologists, psychologists, and philosophers help, or are their paradigms too different? One word answer, yes or no?
Oh, I think it can help. I think it can help, but I think I have a theory of interdisciplinarity too, so I can't go into that theory. So, but I do, Do you want me to say it really quickly?
No. No, I was going to say, but I do want, because I have a theory of interdisciplinarity as well, and I know other people who do as well. So we're going to ask Anthony to schedule another event so we can have we can do injustice to disciplines, or do justice to interdisciplinarity. Sorry, just trying to make sure that we cover as much ground as possible. Michael Babbage, I think, has a really good question about how second person fits into the relation between social sciences and philosophy. I think this also might address some of the questions, or some of the implications of the previous or preceding question. So the social sciences are, or aspire to be, sciences, so they're committed to a third person methodology. Okay. Not sure if I agree with that, but anyway, some philosophers believe that philosophical problems require a first person, or perhaps a second person approach, a view from the inside of social practices. I think that's a really good question, and thus speaks both to the preceding one and to the last question that I read, which is the intersectionality one. What would you say about the second person?
So anthropology these days is an example of where, oh my God, it's not third person. It's the issue of first person and second person sort of interacting with the study and the reports. I mean, this is something that is methodologically, I was talking about the methodology in history, but the methodology in anthropology is so much about this observer relationship and breaking through that observer relationship. And then are you positioning yourself culturally, as an anthropologist? I mean, I think that's very much what anthropologists have been worrying about for the past 30 years. And so I don't think that anthropologists are aiming to do a kind of third person report. And that some of that methodology and those methodological queries are relevant to epistemology and philosophical epistemology. So I think I too would question whether that's true of the social sciences. I also think that all science is value laden, but we don't have to get into that. That's a whole other seminar or symposium, webinar on how to think about the value ladenness of science.
I think we can fit that into our already booked intersectionality seminar.
But I also do think that that I am not committed, like Parsons might be, or some of the others, on seeing practices from the inside as the authoritative understanding of the practice, because I believe in ideology critique. I think that in order to be to engage in critical work, you have to understand the first person and second person perspective, but part of the job is to critique it and to say, yes, that's a product of interpolation, of a subjectivization into a practice, and you reject that. So you have to be able to get outside. So I'm not a social scientist in that sense. The Verstehen crowd, not my crowd.
That's great.
Sorry.
That's great to hear. No, that's great. That's really great to hear. I think it's a really good way of addressing the question, and especially on the constraints of time. Aurora Georgina Bustos Arellano is asking just a quick question about the division of labor. How does activism, advocacy, or allyship how do they do or do not justice to the social? Saludos desde Mexico. Saludos, yes. Aurora.
Hello. So I think that the notion, so there are divisions of labor, but I think part of being taken up in a movement is to find a way to alter your identity to, at least, let me put it this way, so what a movement does is it makes available an alternative identity that is going to be a site of comradeship and solidarity, not in the sense of an ally, but in the sense that we're in this together and it serves all of us to move forward. So in this notion of an ally is, oh, you've got this problem and I'm going to help you and I'm going to be an ally to you. But that is a kind of confused, in my view, way of thinking about what a movement is trying to do. What a movement is trying to do is, for example, moving from prioritizing woman as the category to prioritizing feminism or feminist as the category. So men can be feminists. Yes, they can. And I don't want men as my ally standing by the side going, yay, Sally, do your thing. I want them to be on the ground with me, in the march with me, and to see that it's in their interest too that we change. And the same is true of race. It is in my interest that we dismantle white supremacy. Some people, white people, are going to think, oh no, of course, you've got all the privilege. No, that privilege is unjust. I don't want it. I want to disown it. And so it's good for me for white supremacy to fall. And I am not here as an ally to help out Black people. I'm here to promote justice for all of us. And so I think that what I want to promote is a different way of thinking about movement. So the division of labor isn't, oh, the most seriously affected and then all the others who are going to try and help them out, but all of us together, right? So I don't know if that really helps. And then the division of labor is who's going to print the posters and who's going to design the bumper stickers and who's going to raise the money. That's the division of labor, not who's white, who's Black.